Stay tuned. Ahead, I'll talk with Rachel Kushner about her novel, Creation Lake. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Rachel Kushner is a New York Times best-selling author and a Booker Prize finalist who's been twice shortlisted for the National Book Award. Her previous bestsellers include The Mars Room, The Flamethrowers, and Telex from Cuba. She joins us to talk about Creation Lake. Rachel, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thanks so much.
Rachel, this is a spy novel. Was there a particular inspiration for it?
I mean, it's a spy novel in one respect, which is that the narrator herself is a former, now disgraced FBI agent who has been hired by some shadowy consortium of private interests to infiltrate a bunch of young leftists who formed a commune in remote rural France. And there are other aspects of the book that don't really conform to the spy genre at all, kind of more philosophical, really don't conform to genre. I feel we write a novel and invent, in a sense, the form that answers to the needs of the themes of the book itself and the mood and the feel of the book. But in terms of choosing to have this woman who is a disgraced former FBI agent, that was rather explicitly drawn from incidences that I had seen take place in real life. Sadie, as she tells the reader to call her, which really, we don't know her name. We only know her over the short 6 weeks in which she's attempting to complete this one job. She tells the reader about her experience being fired by the FBI, having attempted to entrap this young man who was an eco-activist in Northern California. And she seduces him and convinces him that in part of their courtship, he needs to participate with her in building a bomb and planning an act of sabotage. And that was based on a real incident that happened to a friend of a friend, a young guy, perhaps somewhat naive, who was entrapped by an FBI agent. And he was actually convicted and sentenced to 21 years in federal prison, served 9 of those years. And then his lawyer was able to establish and prove that he'd been entrapped, and he was let go. The conviction was overturned. And so I sort of gave that origin myth to Sadie. I had asked myself as I watched that case go on, what is the mentality of the kind of person who misrepresents themselves to other people as their chosen profession and isn't motivated by a sense of, whether it's right or wrong, a sense that they believe in justice, that they're doing the right thing. In fact, this woman was an agent provocateur who is inventing the possibility of violence where none previously might have existed at all. So in writing the book, I was sort of answering my own question by creating the persona and the psyche of somebody who lives by this kind of manipulation and dissimulation.
That was going to be one of my questions about Sadie and her makeup. What was it in her background, her personality, that led her to act in this way and to be an undercover agent?
Well, I don't know the answer to that question, and I understand that it's a natural one to have, and yet when we look at the detective genre, like with the books of, for instance, Raymond Chandler, we don't really need to know what motivates Marlowe. We just need to know how he interprets the signs and symbols in the world around him. Sadie herself, whenever an opportunity might arise for something like backstory, where you would finally know, where this woman was from, what kind of family she was from, what incidences in her own background would lead her to make the choices that she makes. Instead, my instinct was very strongly to have her pull back and tell the reader about a previous job that she'd completed, another time in which she set out to destroy the lives of other people, as she is planning to do just now. And it seemed more logical to me to create her as a sort of like an onion. There are just layers of previous guises. It felt that to me that in completing a specific job. She's drawing upon her own experiences at building a set of tools, a way to trick other people rather than thinking about her own deep life. It's just it's a book that's not a character study in quite that same way. I felt that we would know her best by knowing the ways in which she deceives herself rather than for her capacity to reflect honestly on who she actually is. And, in a sense, she's really not the main character of the book, in my opinion. And that would be Bruno Lacombe, the elder whose communiques she is reading and says she's examining them to find evidence of sabotage, but really she's reading them because it's almost like he's her only friend.
And in that exchange of information, somehow Neanderthals come into the story here. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, they do. When I started writing this novel, after I finished my last one, The Mars Room, I just was suddenly really interested in prehistory. Maybe everyone goes through a phase in their life where they are, but it felt to me like and I know that, so much of it's speculation to think about the time before the written down. We do have an archaeological record, and now we have genetic research that has allowed us to know a lot about Neanderthals that we didn't previously know based on the mapping of their entire genome. And some of that research seemed to have totally upended what anthropologists thought they knew about migration patterns. And I'm just a layperson, but looking at some of the research, I could see that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens had, quote unquote, made contact, 500,000 years ago, and then had made contact again 30,000 years ago. And these natural questions arise of, okay, so these two different species of people were in Europe and Asia and North Africa at the same time. And did they not interact because of tribal differences and beliefs, or did they simply not know one another were there because these tracts of land were so sparsely populated? I don't know, but I started to think that it's a kind of wonderful playground for ideation on the part of the novelist. In a certain way, when I imagine small groups of people living nomadically, they seem like people I can imagine more intimately than I can, say, Etruscan cultures. When I look at pottery at the Metropolitan Museum of New York, those people seem more exotic to me and to be from a culture I don't know anything about. Whereas, again, romantic as it is, the rudimentary people, the first people are very, they're open to projection. And so I started to think about early people. And also I was aware of a real life French philosopher who has been a mentor to some people I know, leftists, who formed a commune in France. And he's thought of as anti-civilization and someone who is trying to re-examine certain components of primitive life, asking the question of how to proceed by looking back at how earlier forms of life did things. And, have we missed signs? Where was this wrong turn that humanity took? And so I built this character, Bruno Lacombe, partly inspired by this particular French philosopher, Jacques Camus, but then he's his own man. He describes our current reality and the questions we face like this. He says, currently, we are hurtling toward extinction in a shiny driverless car. And the question is, how do we exit this car? So I feel that it's not an inaccurate way to depict our current reality. And it's a fair question, but it's not an easy one to answer at all and requires, some feats of imagination on the part of a character like Bruno, who is interested in this deep underground world. I also spend a lot of time in the part of France where I set the book. And there one is in constant sort of awareness of ancient people, because you can walk a path next to a river and the path has been continuously used for 500,000 years by different species of human. And it's very, the past is very present there. So I imagined this man who goes underground and feels that by occupying his cave, he has entered a plane of reality where all different planes of time are merged onto one plane. And I personally have felt that in France. And I have a son who spends a lot of time in French caves. He worked the last 2 summers as a guide, bringing French children into caves, and he goes like a mile underground. And so I have access to the underground world, and it was something that I was thinking a lot about.
As you mentioned earlier, this isn't strictly a spy novel. You explore a lot of different themes, and you've touched on it a little bit, but what would you say are some of the other themes that your book explores?
Well, what are the themes my book explores? Water, the climate, the difficulty of farming in France today, dissimulation. I mean, the title Creation Lake can kind of be interpreted a few different ways. If it references the narrator herself, it's the creation of identity, or false identity. It's also this sort of human culture and the way that it relates to nature. I don't know. The book later on sort of moves from earth to sky and is about cosmology. There's some ideas about that at the very end in terms of the ways in which human cultures have oriented themselves to the stars for roughly 9/10 of human time, but no longer do. We've cut ourselves off from that. Most people can't even see the Milky Way. But I see it as a somewhat hopeful book. That's just my own experience of it, was that it was strangely therapeutic to write, especially in the sense of having a character like Bruno who sees people as fundamentally good, and wants to figure out a way in which the whole human project can be supported by a sense that there is terrific meaning to human life, rather than the sense that I think especially young people have right now, which is that our culture is somewhat disposable and that it's full of disposability. And I was interested in the opposite of that.
I'm always interested in the process of putting a book together. And given the locations and the topics and themes that you cover in this book, what kind of research challenge did that pose for you?
Well, this is a book that I had started thinking about writing way back in late 2008, after I watched a commune that I was personally familiar with get raided by the French police, and then watched the court case that resulted from that wind its way slowly through the French justice system. As I mentioned, I spend a lot of time in the region of France where I set the book. So some of the research, quote unquote, wasn't really research, but just living and following my interests and drawing upon the opportunities that present themselves to me naturally through who I'm married to. My husband is very familiar with French philosophy, French politics. He translates. He knows a lot about French history. My son can go down into the caves and report back on what he sees there, because I don't want to go a mile underground. In terms of the prehistory and Bruno's speculations, I had just become naturally interested in this subject myself. And so I was reading books of anthropology and going into caves myself where you can see cave paintings. So I don't know about the challenges. I follow my interests, and I see each novel thus far as being an occasion to put into the round things that seem to have been absorbed by me and to have remained in my notebooks, in my memory, in my thoughts. And the book is a way to sort of synthesize everything and figure out why I've held on to it, why I think it's important, why it matters to me. I mean, for each of us, it's like the world we live in has something to do with us. And so even as I'm looking outward and gazing at these and inspecting them and turning them over, it's also a self-examination. So I never really would try to learn about something that seemed insurmountable to me in order to put it in a book, and rather to approach bodies of knowledge that I'm already tussling with. And those are what go into my novels.
There's a question I like to ask authors of fiction, and it's this. If you could spend a day in real life with one of the characters from your novel, who would it be and why?
Well, it would be Bruno, because he's the heart and soul of the novel, and a person who demonstrates what I think of as a capacity for gentleness. And I'm fascinated by people who are deeply gentle, in part because I think they can have an effect on other people and produce an inspiration to be that way. And I would love for Bruno to have that effect on me.
The novel is Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner. Rachel, thank you for talking with me today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your questions.
If you'd like to purchase Creation Lake, I've placed a link for you in the description below. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. Meanwhile, here are 2 more books you might find interesting. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.